Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. It was 25 years ago, the last time Congress attempted to regulate the media. And that was at a time before there even was this thing we now call social media. There are now greater calls, more intense calls, particularly after the Trump administration has finally departed and the events of January 6th, the insurrection in Washington, D.C. Greater calls for regulation of social media, but the problem is much thornier than we may imagine. And so I invited Professor Phil Napoli from Duke University, a professor of public policy and someone who's thought deeply and written extensively on social media in a time of disinformation. Really rollicking conversation about the First Amendment, government regulation, the rise of social media and how our media has evolved over the last couple of generations, and just how sticky the problem is with the so-called solutions or regulations to create greater problems than those they're trying to correct. Fascinating conversation. I know you will enjoy, so stay tuned for this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Welcome to my guest, Phil Napoli, a professor of public policy at Duke University and the author of a recent book on our topic today. The book is called Social Media and the Public Interest, Media Regulation in the Disinformation Age. So first of all, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. Greatly appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks.
So we have a lot to talk about on this subject, since I think really throughout the Trump years and with everything coming to a head in the way it did on January 6th of this year, more and more focus on the role of social media in our culture and our politics. And of course, the president of the United States being banned permanently from Twitter, along with a number of other people. It seemed like that was all you heard on Fox News for a while, was how outrageous it is that these private companies could ban an individual. So lots to talk about. I guess I was thinking to start with, well, first of all, I should ask you for a little background on yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you come to an interest in this subject through your writing and your research.
Sure. So I'm in the public policy school, where we have a center that I'm affiliated with called the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. And so we really do try to focus on the intersection of all these issues we're seeing come to a head in our news media sector, broadly defined, and where there is policy relevance. Where might there be relevant policy interventions? And for years, a lot of my work was around issues of, something very different. It was media ownership in years past, or it was even more recently around should there be some sort of policy interventions to help keep local journalism afloat. And then as these social media platforms emerged as significant sources of news and information, obviously it raises a whole host of potential policy issues. I mean, it's certainly the case that if we look at our country in particular, we can't point to much policy making that has happened in this space at all. Certainly lots of hearings, lots of policy deliberations and things of that sort, but not much policy action of any kind.
Well, and another arc through the last, 30, 40 years, maybe longer, that I was thinking about this morning is the intersection of media and our politics. For years and years, you heard from Republicans from the right about liberal bias in the media, liberal control of the media, which also has undertones of anti-Semitism to it through our political history. And then you get to the Trump years, which is not only, it seems to me, defined by so much disinformation and false information, but sharpening the sword in the criticism of the media, going so far as to call the media the enemy of the people, which is a very loaded accusation. until we get to, the most dramatic events we've seen in a long time in our politics with the insurrection on January 6th. How do you see that arc and the relationship between the lack of policy or the lack of regulation and the need for some kind of regulation?
And I think what's interesting about that constant assault and critique of the news media is that it coincides with a technological moment when the typical news consumer is under the impression that there are a wide range of alternatives, and then certainly that there's access to so many more voices and so many more viewpoints. One of the points I make in the book is, as social media and mobile technologies began to proliferate, what we heard so often in the journalism world is now everyone is a journalist. That was a mantra. We were going to democratize journalism. And as I've repeated over and over again, how come social media made everyone a journalist? I don't think it made everyone a lawyer. It didn't make everyone a brain surgeon. It did, and we just discounted and just voluntarily sort of abandoned this notion of any kind of the importance of journalistic norms, of journalistic authority. All of that just went out the window, and these critiques obviously pile onto that. So that we have, multiple generations of news consumers at this point that are, and data bears this out, not only just, incapable of distinguishing between news and opinion, but incapable of distinguishing between legitimate and authoritative and trustworthy news sources and those that are blatant disinformation purveyors. We're seeing this at the national level. We're seeing this at the local level. So it was a really kind of a perfect storm of a particular, political message with a particular technological environment. And of course, all of that heaped on top of what was already a fairly politically polarized, population.
Well, and the relationship between the media and democracy seems to present some interesting, the neutral way of saying it, but really disturbing, more to the point, contradictions, it seems to me, because in the era where you had basically three major news outlets on television and a dominant print media in any particular community, the accusation of a liberal bias in the media might have meant something. But whether everybody's a journalist or not, we certainly have a complete decentralization of the media, atomization of the media. And you would think, going from a time in terms of individual participation in our politics from the early days in our country where you had to be white, male, and own land, to now where everybody, you hope, ideally everybody has a vote. This idea that everybody has a voice and a vote seems to have created less democracy, not more democracy.
Right, and I think there's a couple things there. One of those we have to obviously return to is sort of our relationship between the First Amendment and democracy, right? In terms of what is it that free speech is intended to achieve. But what you said before too about this atomization, I actually sort of use the Big Bang analogy a fair bit, which is, the internet comes along and yes, there's this atomization, and yet the response to that, if you think about it, was the emergence and the embracing of these, what I call really funnels. Facebook is a funnel, YouTube is a funnel, Twitter is a funnel, a way of taking what used to be this very atomized content that used to be available that you have to go find on individual web pages and figure out a way to turn it into the more traditional push model of delivering content to people. Right. When I teach my classes, I have undergraduate students, and the question I love to ask them these days is, how many of you have a homepage, your own web page? And almost none of them do anymore. And I try to explain to them that there was a time when every student had a homepage, right, and they can't even fathom that because they think, well, what a waste of time. Who would go to it? And I'm like, exactly. Right. And that's what social media did, was sort of provided an audience delivery mechanism and created efficiencies for advertisers, for content creators, for us as media consumers, to cope with what was, such an atomized environment for that relatively brief time.
Well, and again, you would think that would be something that would promote democracy, meaning the exchange of ideas, right? The old idea of the town square, or the general store where you'd go to read the one copy of the newspaper that was available in your town, and then everyone would stand around and talk about it, exchange ideas on it. Here you now have these communities where you'd think you could go for a varied exchange of ideas and viewpoints, and yet it's just now accepted as the definition of our time that we are more polarized and more in our own info bubbles than ever before.
Well, keep in mind, right, that was exactly the discourse in the early days of social media. I mean, perhaps looking in hindsight, perhaps there was nothing more sort of damaging to how policymakers looked at social media than the Arab Spring, when everyone hailed that as this democratizing moment. And the reality is, if you look at media history, the history of so many different media technologies, there is that sort of initial utopian exuberance. Cable TV was supposed to be bringing us opera and our town council meetings. It was, if you go back and look at the early discourse around cable TV, it was supposed to have all these incredible democratizing effects. We were all supposed to be voting in our city council meetings, in our school board meetings, through interactive cable television systems. I mean, we could go on and on with, that's that, and that's one of the realities. And part of the problem is the fact that the early adopters of most new communications technologies are very different from the people who, from the mass adopters that come later. So there's very little about how a technology is originally used and initially used that really is predictive of how it ultimately evolves. And so you think about cable TV and the crap that fills, Bravo was, again, was where we were supposed to watch opera. Go watch a couple hours of Bravo today and see and how that has worked out. So really, social media has taken us in a very similar trajectory. And ironically, we learned nothing from the lessons of media history, and were caught off guard by the ways that subsequent actors were able to exploit it and use it for other purposes. But the other part of that too is not to forget that the real new wrinkle in this were these curation algorithms that filter our content for us and ended up, again, not intentionally, doing so in ways that allowed the democracy damaging content in many ways to be advantaged over the democracy enhancing content.
Well, and we're moving eventually in our conversation toward what specific regulations do you think are appropriate and are achievable. But I want to come back to something you introduced into these many historical and value-based concepts that affect what we're talking about, and that's the First Amendment. It's not and I keep thinking to history, and I was a journalist before I was a lawyer, and so this is something I think about all the time. And I also have an interest in history, and in particular, I'm working on a project involving mid 1700s in America and the American press, and kind of the development of the idea of what then was literally a free press, a free printing press, and how that influenced the First Amendment to come. So, it's not the first time in our country's history where we've had powerful media engaging in disinformation. I mean, if we had the yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst. That was not all the news fit to print. It was not objective. It was notoriously slanted towards a certain agenda. So we've had a First Amendment in this country, as I've always thought, a centerpiece of individual liberty and really a bulwark of democracy in this country, unique among democratic countries around the world. So what about today and the media and the prevalence, dominance of disinformation, the great influence of disinformation that we see in the media today? Not just on social media. I mean, you see this in more mainstream media that have come up, Fox News and kind of the baby Fox Newses that now have gained an audience. So these are not really companies technically you can apply the First Amendment to. They're private companies. They can ban whoever they want. They can regulate themselves any way they want. It's not a violation of anyone's First Amendment right if they do that. Right. So how do we even think about regulating media before we get to the specific ways we should regulate? How do we even think about that when we have these values in our country of private activity, First Amendment right, and the right not to be bound by the First Amendment as to your own private activities?
Sure. Now, this is something I talk about a fair bit in the book. One of the things about this particular moment is it seems like it really has to compel us. You talked about individual liberties and you talked about democracy, right? And it reminds us that when we look at First Amendment theory, there are actually some competing or some potentially conflicting interpretations of what the First Amendment is for, right? So if we think of the First Amendment, and this has been the more predominant interpretation, right, as protecting individual liberties, that can conflict with the other, less widely embraced in reality interpretation, which is enhancing the democratic process. It's the individualist versus the collectivist interpretations of the First Amendment. And the collectivist version of the First Amendment is more about creating a democracy enhancing speech environment, right? Where an informed voter is the ultimate goal, and does allow and even require some government interventions probably to make sure that that is happening effectively. The individualist version of the First Amendment and that has been a version that we hear that the platforms have for a long time, or certain ones have espoused, even though they haven't actually followed it, that they've always been engaging in content filtering and things like that. But the old rhetoric around Facebook was that it was just a tool for an individual to express him or herself. Mm-hmm. Well, we know that was too simplistic a notion of what a Facebook does. So to the question, so I think the first step is to, for us to revisit and perhaps rebalance how we, which First Amendment interpretation is most appropriate for this moment, right? But yes, and so and the other thing we need to do, that gets us part of the way. But the other thing I have proposed, and it seems less nutty now than it did when I first proposed it, because if we think about our, when we do regulate media, one of the things we always in this country require is a rationale. It's not enough to see, there's a disinformation problem. We have to have a underlying technological rationale. So where do we have media regulation in this country? We have media regulation primarily in the broadcast sector, and it's motivated, it's rationalized primarily by the particular characteristics of the medium. Right. And there's been lots and lots of debate and critique over whether the notion of spectrum scarcity really holds up.
I was always very skeptical of the rationale for regulating the broadcast.
Right. And there's been other ones that have been relevant there. Is it uniquely pervasive? Is it, the one that holds up the best, even to the most conservative critics of broadcast regulation, is that broadcasters utilize a public resource. Separate from whether it's a scarce public resource or not a scarce public resource, but the idea that you are using a truly collectively owned resource, which is, the spectrum is in theory owned by the people. I mean, you can find that language used throughout the whole history. Yeah. And the reality is it doesn't, it's really owned by the government is how how that model is worked out. But So
that was the rationale for the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC.
Absolutely.
How can we have a whole agency built around the idea of telling broadcast companies what to do?
Yep.
Yeah, I never.
And the reality, of course, is, within the scope of, what speech regulation could look like, the regulation of speech on broadcasting has not been, there have been moments, and what's interesting right now, people will often point to sort of the most aggressive form of regulation that ever took place there, was the Fairness Doctrine.
Yep.
And right now there's an incredible conversation that has rekindled around the Fairness Doctrine and its potential relevance in the social media space. We actually wrote a paper about that very recently. And just as we finished the paper, I said, for the heck of it, let's look at Twitter and see how frequent the mentions of the Fairness Doctrine are over the past year and a half. And just in January, exponential. So it's a really interesting topic of conversation that's happening.
Just for those who don't know, just briefly, just explain what that was and
Sure.
why it was repealed and why now we're talking about that again. Because
Sure, yeah, and so the Fairness Doctrine applied only to broadcasters and required broadcasters to provide, had two prongs to it. Broadcasters had to provide news coverage of controversial issues of public importance, I think that's how they phrased it, and then needed to make sure that all legitimate perspectives on that issue received equal consideration. And so what it ultimately sort of devolved into was sort of which has happened in our journalistic system more broadly, into the both sidism of, okay, and literally, taken to absurd lengths, which is if, there was something aired about cigarettes causing cancer, then the tobacco industry was entitled to respond with their own perspective on the relationship between smoking and cancer. We had presidents on both sides of the political spectrum, Nixon and Johnson, Kennedy, all made frequent use of the Fairness Doctrine to try to improve the coverage that they were receiving, to try to intimidate news outlets. Nixon was famous for making Fairness Doctrine complaints against broadcast outlets that were owned by the Washington Post as a way to try to even impact the print news coverage he was receiving. So it's something that is not looked on particularly fondly by anybody, but there's been legislation introduced over the past 2 years, in some cases very explicitly, in some cases more implicitly, seems to be trying to sort of revive the Fairness Doctrine as a mechanism for combating what you mentioned earlier, the perception that the platforms are suppressing conservative viewpoints. And so that there would need, that some sort of, perhaps Section 230 immunity is conditional upon a platform demonstrating sufficient fairness in an audit. That was Josh Hawley's idea from 2019. But even the more recent Section 230 legislative proposals have some more watered down version of that underneath the surface.
And what is Section, because President Trump talked about Section 230 a lot, giving that more teeth. What is that, and how's that kind of the new version of the Fairness Doctrine?
Sure. So Section 230 is part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which is important always to note because we are once again, as we often find ourselves in this country, talking about a piece of legislation that was drafted and is being applied now to a technology that did not even exist. So it was drafted in response to, CompuServe bulletin boards. and
what is that? I remember what that is.
Yeah, half the people listening are like, what is he talking about? But basically what it grants platforms, digital, those who host third-party content, it grants them two important things. One is immunity from civil liability for the third-party content that they host. So that's why nobody can sue Facebook for the disinformation that might be on Facebook. At the same time, though, it also grants them the right to engage in content moderation without incurring any liability. Some of the early lawsuits that spawned Section 230 were some court decisions where the judge decided, well, once you engage in any kind of editorial decision-making about the kind of content you host, that triggers liability for everything that you host.
That's
And so, so that, and of course, at that particular moment, the internet is just taking off and the economy is booming. And even the members of Congress who drafted it have said this very explicitly, which is, we just did not want to do anything to slow down the growth of the internet economy. So what it really provided was absolute carte blanche for platforms to operate at the scale they've come to operate. We prioritize, you could argue that we just prioritized scale, and really prioritized, which is interesting too, prioritized or helped to sort of incentivize this business model of hosting third-party content above all else. I once asked, and I once asked someone who's a very sort of tech libertarian, I said, tell me what, the web would have looked like without Section 230. And his one-word answer was Netflix. And I always found that pretty interesting, because a part of me was like, well, that doesn't sound so horrible. But a more bottlenecky type of realm where there's more stringent gatekeeping happening than certainly what we've grown accustomed to. And again, that model that developed was accompanied by that discourse of democratization, and we saw the evidence of it presumably in the Arab Spring, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what takes us to where we are now. And that question of, is this a genie that can get put back in the bottle?
Well, I mean, Netflix may not seem offensive to most people because it is what it is. And it's basically the new version of the old video stores. So what? But if the internet was Netflix, it wouldn't be the internet we know. It wouldn't look anything like it.
Absolutely.
But so, okay, so why, given that, and so when Facebook talks about, we welcome a discussion about regulation. It's been 25 years since we've had any. That's what Facebook's talking about, right? The Communications Decency Act from 1996.
Yeah, it could, there's certainly seems like there's room for some updating, and there's been plenty of talk about. Now, I don't think Facebook, I don't think their version of regulation is one in which they see Section 230 modified or eliminated. They would, and it's very easy, I think, for the discussion about, social media, disinformation issues, and et cetera, to sort of zero in exclusively on Section 230. But it's also important to recognize that you could modify, relax, eliminate Section 230, and there's still a whole host of problems that does not solve. If you think about all the ways a piece of disinformation could be crafted, as many of them are, that don't trigger any kind of libel or defamation lawsuit. I mean, if you keep saying the election is rigged, the election was rigged, well, who do you sue? Who has the right to sue in that case? That's what I found so interesting about the Dominion lawsuits is, how come we haven't been seeing lawsuits like this happen about so many different issues over the past 4 years or so, right? I mean, it was interesting. Once a very specific, within the context of this larger rigged election argument, once a specific company was having their reputation damaged, whoa, and now Rudy Giuliani is facing a $1.3 billion lawsuit. I don't know if anyone saw the news footage, the footage yesterday from the Newsmax interview with the MyPillow guy.
Yes,
the MyPillow guy came on Newsmax and started going on about Dominion, and the host, and this is Newsmax, went bonkers trying to shut this guy up.
Yeah, because they're worried about their lives.
They're worried about it.
I think
the anchor literally walked off the set.
I saw that clip. See, I think this is a good thing, though, and I guess I'm still challenging or raising the question: why should there be any regulation? It's if Facebook feels pressure in the market, so to speak, both the marketplace of ideas and the marketplace of our economy, which they did after the 2016 election, when there was all this talk about Russian bots and disinformation and how Facebook was used and the lack of monitoring and controls that Facebook had internally, their stock went down. They got a lot of public criticism for that. And I don't know all the details of what they did to address that problem internally, but I think most people have said that we didn't have anywhere near the level of foreign interference on social media platforms in the 2020 election. Was all run out of the White House if it came from anywhere. Yep. Compared to what we saw in 2016. So isn't that the market, so to speak, working? And if you want to be an idiot or ignorant and put your voice on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, just like you can stand on a street corner in this country and spout something that's false. But if you do it in a libelous way, like Giuliani and My Pillow guy did, you're also going to face sort of the free market armed with laws that we already have on the books. And Dominion is going to come after you, as personally, I think they should. So what's wrong with that framework as it is, without pushing for more regulation, which could have all kinds of unintended consequences?
That's a great question. One of the concepts I talk about in the book is whether, in fact, we find ourselves in the midst of market failure in the marketplace of ideas. What is that? What would be the indicators of market failure in the marketplace of ideas? And it's complicated because we have to recognize that the marketplace of ideas is layered on top of our media marketplace, which is also complicated because it is what we call a dual product marketplace. There is us as media consumers, right? And the market for content that we consume. And then there are the advertisers who are in the market for audiences. So the consumer in one product is actually the product. The consumer in one market is the product in another market. And so one of the problems and there's very recent reports illustrating this, is advertisers, for example, are placing ads on disinformation purveying sites, major advertisers, and they often don't know it because of the scale at which the online ad economy works. They're using what we call programmatic media buying. There's the process of placing ads on sites is automated, and so major advertisers, some intentionally but most unintentionally, are engaging with these ad networks that have these sites as part of their networks, and so the economic lifeblood for disinformation purveyors is much healthier than a robust marketplace of ideas should allow. And in fact, a colleague of mine and I just wrote a piece about this last week, where we basically argued that of all the blame allocating that's been going around, advertisers have largely gotten off easy. That they play a hugely vital role in, facilitating this disinformation ecosystem. So that's just one. That's just one of the ways then the marketplace of ideas can suffer market failure, because one of the key stakeholders that has an influence in that marketplace is valuing, where are persuadable consumers over what is true, what is valid, etc. Right. So there's a disconnect.
Right. So I still think, though, the point you're making is, to my ears, an argument for no regulation, because again, we have forces in the market that can regulate. Sure, there are advertisers.
But where is the evidence that the advertisers are changing their behaviors? Which raises such an interesting question. We were pondering this the other day. Could you imagine? Yes, we think about how the First Amendment protections around commercial speech are less. Could you imagine a model going forward where there's some sort of Federal Trade Commission, say, regulation that prohibits advertisers advertising on sites that are demonstrated disinformation purveyors as determined by objective and certified third-party fact-checking organizations?
So that makes me very nervous. That would make me extremely nervous.
And if that one makes you nervous, then we've got nothing.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, where's the market? I think, again, it seems to be a call coming from the right with the complaints about cancel culture, which I don't really understand. It's been a great tradition in this country that we use collective voices in protest against something we disagree with. When I was growing up in California in the 70s, there were boycotts of lettuce companies because of their bad practices with the farm workers, and Cesar Chavez bringing that to attention. What's wrong with that? I mean, Martin Luther King talked about boycotting certain companies and products. So now we call it cancel culture because we have access to platforms of communication that we didn't have a generation or two ago. So maybe there's more power. But what's wrong with that? If people want to express their opposition to my pillow guy, and if that leads Bed Bath & Beyond and Walmart to pull his damn pillows off the shelves, what's wrong with that? I mean, that's just the market of ideas and the power of a collective political voice exercising that power without investing the government with that power.
That would be the much preferred solution, right? But again, forces us to confront the question of, is that market is that market working effectively and efficiently? And that is, I make the argument in the book, which is old now, that in fact, it might have, one can make a compelling case that the results of the 2016 election were an indicator of market failure on the basis, and I went back and looked at so many different analyses, and I use if we could show that compelling evidence that a large sector of the electorate voted in a way that would not seem to be in their best interests. And I remain fascinated by all the political analysis and economic analysis that have been done that seem to suggest that, for example, a large proportion of Trump supporters tend to be people who would be harmed rather than helped by his policies. And I think, okay, maybe that's the evidence of market failure in the marketplace of ideas we need to be thinking about. And do we look at January 6th, at what was motivating those people and what they did and what they thought they were doing as, again, evidence of market failure in the marketplace of ideas? So, and that traditionally has been the role of government, to try to correct for market failure. But yes, can we, especially in this environment, as partisan as our policymaking has become, I can't imagine a time in terms of feeling less comfortable about putting the government in that role of trying to better calibrate the effective functioning of the marketplace of ideas. And so it is a real shame that we can't at this moment have nothing but praise for Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and Google for the work that they've done. But the reality is, my goodness, every week there is a new report coming out. A big part of journalism today is just that. I call it the platform beat, is illustrating yet another. Now it is the fact that depending on your political views around the election, you were being served ads for combat gear on Facebook. That's not a good look.
Well, it isn't, but of course, one answer to that is just as if you didn't like the content of a particular television program. I mean, there was a time when Three's Company, a silly sitcom on one of the major networks, was so controversial. Hey, change the channel. You don't like what Howard Stern is saying on the radio? Change the channel. If you don't like Facebook and what they're doing, putting ads in front of you based on whatever their algorithms are, don't use Facebook. I mean,
but that's the point here, is that was exactly and that's a big difference. Let's not forget that one, between the example you described, the advertisers who advertise on Three's Company versus the advertisers who advertise on Facebook. The ability to deliver the ad to exactly who wants it and exactly who will respond positively to it that we have now is unprecedented. And that's a massive difference. And so the point is, if you are thinking, this government needs to be overthrown, well, how about some combat gear to help you with that? Right. That's what we're talking about.
Well, I think, as to those insurrectionists, when somebody commits a crime, often they're consigned to some kind of community service. I'd like to see that with those people, and maybe more broadly, because I don't think they understand the first thing about civics in our country or our history. Or, the problem though is they were following a leader who also had no respect for the rule of law, who had I don't know the man ever read the Constitution, let alone understood it. And he's out leading these people, leading the charge. Okay, so what if we, and again, Facebook is now saying we welcome more regulation. Let's have that conversation. So and we might expect more and more conversation and even more development of policy and perhaps even development of legislation in this Congress now with everything that's happened. So what do you see then as the possible specific ways that new law could regulate big internet, big social media companies?
So let me go back to, because I didn't get sidetracked. So we still need to build that, whatever it is, on some kind of compelling rationale.
Right.
And the reason I was bringing up the broadcast example and the idea of spectrum as a public resource is that I actually think the case could be made that if you think about a Facebook or a Twitter, they, even more legitimately than broadcasters, have built their business on a publicly owned resource. And that resource is our data. There is this ongoing debate in Europe and here, it's sort of been obviously submerged of late, but there was once, this concern about our data security and our privacy and who owns our data. Is it ours? Is it theirs? And there's a lot of analysis in this space that, it makes the point that, hey, you know what? We should, because the value in that data is when it's aggregated, right?
Right.
So
that's how they're able to target advertising.
Right. And you make this individual decision to allow them to take your data, and then it becomes part of this valuable collective. Your individual data are basically worthless, right? But in the aggregate, there's value. And maybe the right resolution to that property rights question in user data is to think of user data as collectively owned and collectively held and somehow collectively governed. And if we think that opens the door to sort of something, and I'm not advocating for regulating social media the way we regulate broadcasting, but at least then you have a compelling underlying rationale upon which you can build something equivalent in the sense of say, okay, well, what would the public interest obligations of those who build their business on aggregations of collectively owned user data look like, right? And again, I think, we don't want to go very far, in terms of empowering a federal agency to do much. But even if you think about something, more limited, say, the creation of some sort of, third-party oversight agency, right? I've actually used, it's a random one, but I've used the analogy of the audience measurement industry, Nielsen, or, these companies that measure TV audiences, internet audiences, they have something called the Media Rating Council. It was created in response to a congressional inquiry, but it is an independent oversight board, and it audits measurement systems. It issues best practices. It has a range of authority. Now, in that case, it actually has no enforcement authority. But could we imagine, to me, again, there's somewhere between the pole of, the fear of government regulation and the fear of, Mark Zuckerberg and his individual preferences guiding how content is curated and moderated. I don't know how there's any other solution than trying to really push the ball down the court on some kind of model that maybe borrows from our public broadcasting system, where we have this, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that takes funds and then allocates them to those who are part of the public broadcasting system, some sort of buffer institution. And yes, that generates all the questions about, well, who would be on it and how that would get politicized? Absolutely. But if we deflate that balloon, then I say, again, we're back to, well, we've got nothing, because there's no way you're going to find the model of putting more regulatory authority in the hands of the FCC or putting more faith in the platforms, because both of those options are even more vulnerable to so many different critiques.
Yeah, I thought you were suggesting there could be an agency that would be analogous to the movie ratings
Yeah,
enterprise
that's the
or
space we're
TV
talking
ratings,
about.
you know,
That's what I'm talking about.
which puts you back in Tipper Gore land where, you start arguing about what's obscene.
Mhm.
You'd think, since what we're talking about, I've always wondered, is there a difference between disinformation and misinformation? I don't know. I think, is there a difference?
Technically, yes.
Oh,
Technically, it's intent.
okay.
That, disinformation is, you can think of disinformation almost as a subcategory of misinformation. Misinformation is incorrect information. Disinformation is that information that's produced or shared with the intention of deceiving someone.
All right. Well,
That's,
I mean, that's even more concerning, obviously. But if an outlet is a purveyor of prolific misinformation, probably we end up with the same
well, and
situation.
again, it's important to note, we actually have regulations in place in this country that address disinformation. There are broadcast regulations on the books that nobody's ever heard of, that if a TV station, for example, intentionally disseminates false news, they can lose their license. Who knew, right? We never hear about
that sounds
them.
good.
And in fact, people have tried to, there were complaints filed against, for example, Sinclair Broadcasting at some point over the past couple of years that attempted to sort of, use that existing regulation. Heck, someone even tried to apply it in a filing to the FCC against Fox News. Now, Fox News isn't a broadcaster. Fox News utilizes the cable infrastructure, and so automatically it doesn't apply. But, and again, there has to be somebody sort of internally, there has to be sort of an internal whistleblower who provides evidence, and so the standards of making the determination of intentionally misinforming somebody are fairly rigorous. And so it really does tend to fall into that. And this is why, too, for the people who, get faint at the idea of our broadcast regulatory apparatus, the reality is it's not, pursued nearly as aggressively as the existing regulatory framework would allow. And so this is a barely used, piece of regulation that, again, even though, your typical First Amendment scholar might not even know it exists. That's how obscure it is, but it is there. So so there is precedent in our country with our First Amendment tradition, and and we have it on the books now.
Well, okay,
directed at disinformation.
so let's extend that then, and your book is the context of your book is from the title is that we're in this disinformation age, intentionally communicating false information. This obscure part of the FCC regulatory scheme that you pointed out would only be applicable against broadcast media outlets. You said it can't be. So Sinclair, yes, which is a very powerful company owning a lot of local broadcast stations, but not Fox, which is on cable, and of course certainly not Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and
well, unless you bought into my treating user data as a public resource. All right, that's why I think the rationales conversation is so important to get worked out even before the specifics of, well, what specifically should we do? Because anything we would suggest on the regulatory front just immediately runs aground against, our current version of the First Amendment as it applies to the digital space. It's just a non-starter. As much as Facebook might invite government regulation, they won't hesitate to, challenge anything that they don't like the looks of on First Amendment grounds.
So that is something then that we could see at least some support for in the new Congress, which would be extending that enforcement authority that now only applies to broadcast media to social media platforms using the ownership or usurping of massive individual data as the basis of their platforms. That actually is their medium, not this
Right.
amorphous
That's their
image.
business model.
Yeah.
That's,
So,
that is their spectrum. That is what they build their business on.
so where then do you think you come down? Because I'll say it, I'm not. I mean, I wring my hands and throw my shoe at the TV or at my laptop if I see it on Twitter. What I feel I can immediately recognize as false information, lying. But do I want to invest the government with the power to decide what is true? I don't like it when the government, as expressed by the president or by the Senate majority leader or the House majority leader, is spreading lies. Now, I think there's room in First Amendment law to allow for prosecution for incitement, which is not protected speech, obviously. But investing a government agency or the government with power to enforce based on what the government decides is true or is false. I mean, that's.
Oh yeah, I mean, can you imagine what
to me pretty scary.
Can you imagine what the past 4 years could have been like?
Exactly. Well, that's the fear.
Yeah, no, and that's why I hope I can't sit here and advocate for that model by any stretch. Like I said, all I can imagine is can we construct some model where there is taking the Facebook oversight board model, for example, and expanding it dramatically in terms of it having applicability across multiple platforms, increasing its authority to give it sort of not just reactive authority, but some proactive, algorithmic auditing authority. Developing collectively reached definitions of disinformation and of, something important that we don't have these days. What is and what is not truly a news source?
Right.
We could all go on Facebook and create a page and call ourselves a news source and use that label and enjoy the benefits that come from being a news outlet. And so we've, again, going back to my mention before, we've sort of just let ourselves just get so lax in terms of and that could become a factor in more of the content moderation and curation practices of these platforms and how their algorithms work. Making meaningful distinctions between different types of sources. This is very hard to do at the level of when the piece of content is the unit of analysis at this scale. That's a level of granularity that's
right. Well, I think that's why too people. And I made this reference earlier, and we hear it from all sides of the political spectrum. I have a liberty interest in being able to say what I want to say, so that on social media platforms, on the internet, in a way that was never true when we had just newspapers and broadcast.
You don't have a right to be on Facebook.
No, I don't have a right.
Trump doesn't have a right to be on Twitter.
I know that. I believe that too. But I think because in the atomization of media, so many people are not just consumers of news from some source or another. They are producers of what they think is news. I'm a producer. My opinion is valuable and has a constitutional right attached to it, which it does. In some sense, we have a right to free speech with certain.
Well, I guess to those larger questions, and this isn't my phrase. I forget who I'm quoting here, but right, you've probably heard it. Freedom of speech does not equal freedom of reach. I wrote a piece a number of years back where I explored the question of what is our First Amendment right of access to an audience. How much, to what extent does the First Amendment guarantee us viewers, listeners, etc.?
I'd say it doesn't.
Well, we should never lose sight of that then.
Yeah. I think that's a critical distinction. Well, one of the other things we've heard in recent years as a way of getting at these issues that we've been talking about, similar to what people talked about at the height of and then the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, is that these companies are too big. We need to break them up. And if we can break them up into smaller pieces, they'll have less power, they'll have less control, and we can defang them in that way. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think there's plenty of good reasons to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But amongst all of them, I've never seen anyone convince me that helps solve the disinformation problem. In fact, that's what's been so interesting about the past few months, is to see, we are starting to see a little bit of atomization, right? We saw half of my family has gone over to Parler. Goodbye. And then, more competitors to Facebook.
Right.
Again, that created an environment where disinformation could be even, more rampant. Now, how do you, so as long as we are realistic about what that action would achieve, and I've not seen, heck, you could even look at the, which is the Congressional Committee that, it's a 400 or 600 page antitrust report, about these platforms. And, you won't find the word disinformation in there at all. There's the linkage there. So yes, it might help advertisers. It certainly might help upstart platforms. It might help innovation, all those things it could very well do. But again, I haven't seen the case made, not only, sort of either speculatively or empirically, that the disinformation problem is, solved.
It's like
there's multiple platforms operating under the same, third-party content hosting model.
It's like taking all the disruptive kids out of the class and putting them in a separate room to themselves. You've taken them out of the one room, but
you know what? They all don't want to go into the room by themselves. They're not going to leave all of them because they want more kids in that room.
Right. Right. There's no evidence it's going to change behavior. So do you have a prediction, or can you offer a prediction then of what you think we're going to see in the next couple of years, in any specific sense?
Gosh, I don't know. I hate predicting. I'd love to say that I think that some kind of third-party governance model, gains traction, because I literally don't see how anything else is even remotely viable. And what that would look like, I don't know exactly, but that's something that I'm working on trying to flesh out a bit more.
Well, and one of the things I wonder about too is, in our politics today, it seems like a lot of what we see, I feel particularly from the right, is espousing of views without necessarily a genuine connection to wanting a policy outcome from those views. That there's political gain to be had in just making the argument. So applied here, that would be, as has been true in political campaigns going back to at least to Nixon, maybe before that. If you have a criticism of the media, that is something that you can talk about in your politics and your campaign trail, and that your base wants to hear, even if it doesn't lead to any actual policy.
And even if the policy that you're advocating wouldn't be an obvious solution to the problem you're complaining about. I mean, there are plenty of Republicans who want to regulate these platforms in various ways, but not in ways that would necessarily affect the disinformation problem. But I think that gets to the other issue too, which is we're really in this problematic space where, and it's a strategic issue, right? Which is, let's make sure to conflate the suppression of certain views with the conflation of falsity or calls to violence. And the platforms, I'm just have been very, very passive in, if I see them go before Congress and get yelled at again for suppressing conservative views, and not once to see one of these CEOs say, the problem is we have very objective standards that we apply. and you people violate them more.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have the data to bear that out. I work with a colleague who has a database of decades of fact checks. And he's working on a book that shows, it's not an equal distribution of falsity, unfortunately. So, it's the platforms are hesitant. Maybe they will be less hesitant now that there's been a change in administration, but they have been very hesitant to say what they know, which is there are certain political persuasions that engage in much more disinformation and misinformation than others for whatever reasons. And certainly the political scientists and the social psychologists can explain to you why. But it is again one of those facts that we cannot ignore.
Well, I think I think minimally, perhaps you'd agree, it's good that we're having this conversation. It's good that not only that you and I are having it, because I'm enjoying it very much, but that these issues and the challenges that make this such a difficult set of problems to think about solutions for in terms of policy, it's good that we're talking about it and debating it and trying to understand it better.
Yeah, let's see if something happens. And that's the thing, is it's not an obvious there's finding out, the solution set is, I can't, like I said, I can't sit here and tell you that I know exactly what's the right thing to do. But yeah, in fact, I have a 9 o'clock that I'm
good. Well, I'm exactly where we need to break then. So Professor Phil Napoli from Duke, and the author of the book, I don't think it's that old, it was just 2019, Social Media and the Public Interest, Media Regulation in the Disinformation Age. We'll put a link to the book in the description. And also, I know you had there was an article about some of your thoughts on the events of January 6th that was in Duke Today. We'll put a link to that in the description as well, so people can get that as well as your bio.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was great talk. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, this was fun. I really enjoyed it too.
Good. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.